You know, it's as if Macbeth happened because he was slipped on an ambition potion, or you know, Othello was slipped a jealousy potion. That's what happens with Wagner. That's why I don't watch Wagner. With fiction, you get a different dynamic. The relationship between an author and what he or she writes is very complex. And sometimes there's a direct connection. There are authors whose fiction really does definitely, clearly, immediately reflect whatever their particular views are. And if their views are ones that I just don't want to be, you know, beaten over the head with, I just won't read them. But most authors, especially if they're good, the relationship's going to be a lot more complex than that. To give an example, there's American writers. For instance, Ernest Hemingway's political viewpoint was much closer to mine than William Faulkner's. But I don't like Hemingway, and I adore Faulkner. And the reason is because of the nature of the fiction itself. Hemingway is a brilliant stylist, no question about it, but his fiction seems to be preoccupied with issues involving manhood that I pretty well resolved by the time I was 14. And I just honestly find him boring. Whereas Faulkner I find, you know, constantly interesting, you know, but I'm sure if I were to sit down with him, you know, especially if Faulkner was drunk, as he often was, that I'm sure my political discussions with him wouldn't probably be very pleasant. But one of my very favorite authors is Dostoevsky, who had horrendous political views. But that doesn't necessarily translate into what they write. You know, and especially if they're good writers, it's likely to be much more complex than that. And that's why, you know, the reason I make an distinction of fiction, something like Mein Kampf, is something that's not fiction. There may be all kinds of reasons to read it that are not involved with art or entertainment. But if you're going to read something of fiction and you enjoy it, read it. You know, you can be aware that the person who wrote it is not somebody you like or agree with in a number of different ways, but so what?
Well, when I think about separating the writer from his or her work, one thing that comes up for me is the difference between should you, can you, and must you. I mean, there's these, I think Nancy would say, well, you know, you should try to do that and read the work for what it is. You know, then comes the, and I agree with that, then comes, well, can you? And that's something Jack brought up, is, you know, difference with work where you've met the writer before getting to the work versus having fallen in love with the work, then you meet the writer and discover who she is an ass. And can you get that out of your head? And I find that if you have read the work and fallen in love with the work first, and then you discover something about this person, it's easier to get over that. You go through all the Kubler-Ross cycles, and, you know, you get to the point where you're back you know, in love with the work again. And you know, I had this problem when, and to go from the, let's see, we're talking about mass murderers, genocide, Nazis, and you know, things like that, just to bring it down to the personal aspect of convention going and meeting people. And you know, when I first started going to conventions and I'd start to meet people, and I'd say, boy, that writer's sort of a jerk. And you know, then you have to say, well, can I still read that writer's work and get the jerk part out of the head, or even just the fact, oh, well, that's that writer's voice, and I don't want to read that book in that writer's voice because that, you know, that work is not, you know, doesn't come across that way. So you have that whole issue. And when I started working in Marvel Comics and discovered, you know, I hate some of these people. You know, how can I read Daredevil again if I don't like the person writing, you know, the comic or something like that? And then finally you get to the must-you. You know, the must-do aspect. There are thousands and hundreds of thousands of books in the world that you're not going to read them all. And if there's one particular writer, there's nothing that says that if you die without reading Orson Scott Card because you have a disagreement over politics, that you committed a great sin in the world. So, you know, I think you can parse who you read and who you don't read without having committed a great crime against literature.
I think you can go even farther than that. I think you can do both. I think you can read the work and be entertained, although I hate that word because what entertains one person bores another. But you can read the work and enjoy it on its own level, and at the same time have an awareness of the person like Jack Abbott who wrote it. A sophisticated reader does not operate only on one level. And I think Paul raised a really crucial issue here in the beginning, which is, since all of us sort of agree with what Scott just said, I'm sure there's a lot of books in the world. If you don't like it, go read something else. The question becomes one of a larger censorship or social pressure to do or not do that.
Yeah, that's where, if we could take it in that direction, at least briefly, because everybody can make the decision for themselves whether to read or not read a particular book, and we all do, like I said. But when pressure arises to take that personal decision public and make it wider and apply to a large segment of the population.
And those with a different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's go talk
Yeah,
about that.
and actually I had 3 little points, and the third one has to do with that. So we'll, first of all, I wanted to raise an example of people for whom what might be morally wrong with them is central to their art. There's a really fine exhibit of on Picasso and Degas at the Clark Art Institute. I'm not sure if it's still up, but it has really, really detailed comparisons in which Picasso is learning from Degas, competing with Degas, etc. And one of the things that's really, really obvious when you see all of these sort of minor sketches you've never seen before is they spent lots and lots and lots and lots of time with naked women, most of whom were prostitutes, some of them who appear to be underage, etc. And there's all kinds of issues of like human trafficking and such that emerge from this, but we don't think of that when we see nude descending the staircase, even though it's absolutely central to the art, and this is absolutely obvious when you go through this.
Well, is that a supposition based on seeing this exhibit, or do you know that?
Which?
The human trafficking.
Well, I mean, prostitution is human trafficking. Okay.
But do you know the prostitutes?
Oh yeah, no, there is Degas, Picasso's sketch Degas and the prostitutes, for example. I mean, that prostitutes are in these pictures and are involved in the production of this art is very obvious from this exhibit. And Degas, little girls are. I mean, my daughter, when she first went to the Metropolitan, she was sketching, saw an artist sketching something, and she decided she wanted to sketch, and she drew an Egyptian ballet god, combining all the things she loved most. But those little girls were not for Elizabeth. Some of the little ballerinas have leering men in the corner. I mean, there's a whole different audience for that. And that's really central to the production, but that's not how we think of some of the great art of the 19th and the 20th century. A second one is, I think, Orson Scott Card, I think, is a really interesting case in point. Because you read Orson Scott Card, there is some disturbing stuff in there that may indicate there's something you don't like about him. I wrote a satire of one of his stories once. On the other hand, when I see, for example, a particular fan who has spent years at a time trying to demonize Orson Scott Card under multiple pseudonyms and IP numbers, I find that extremely creepy, and I find myself feeling if I don't support Orson Scott Card, that maybe there's something wrong with me, even though there is something wrong with his politics.
Can I bring up just one small issue about separate the artistic from the economic, because I think the artistic from the economic comes in, because I've heard a number of people say, well, I'll read him or her, but I don't want him or her to get any of my money. So there's that issue, that if you find their lifestyle or the politics offensive enough, you don't want to put money in their pocket, but they don't mind reading some pirated or library copy. They just don't want to support or make a donation to that person's life. So sometimes people separate the two, and I think that's part of the issue.
Add a detail. Also, this same person or group of people, as I recall, was working hard to make sure to try to get library associations not to give him awards or to take awards back, which is, and again, I think way over some kind of line.
So what is the response that an individual can take in the face of that kind of pressure?
Writer or reader?
Both. I mean, what is there an obligation that an individual writer and reader has?
Okay, I think you got to start with this. Look, we live in a society, and there's going to be pressure on you. That has been true in every society that ever exists. Anybody think there's ever exists a society where no social pressure comes on anybody who does anything that is going to alienate a large chunk of that society is living in a fantasy world. And Elizabeth's a friend of mine. I was actually at the forum where she gave that talk that she talks about her remarks. And actually, she and I were allied on the particular subject under discussion there. I do not agree with the remarks she made later on the specific issue, and I think personally the decision to ban her is just silly. I will tell her all this next time I see her. But I can tell you what her reaction is going to be. It's the same reaction I have. Those of you who know him, John Ringo and I are poles apart politically, but there's one subject on which we both agree. We both get threatened periodically by readers that I will not read your books because of your hard politics. And our response is, screw you. And that's going to be Elizabeth's response to the whole thing, and it's going to be the only response a writer can have. You have to have, a little toughness here. I mean, you're going to come under a certain amount of pressure unless, you don't do anything to offend anybody. And that's just the way it is. there's a different issue comes in. I don't even have a problem, although I disagree strongly with somebody who tries to get library associations. You're not actually violating anybody's civil rights when you do that. It becomes an issue when the government gets involved. And that's when it becomes a completely different issue, is when a formal and official censorship starts coming into it.
The most challenged book to the American Library Association last year, and for several years, a series of books, have been the Harry Potter books. Because people object, some parents object to the occult in them. And they would like them removed from school bookshelves, they would like them removed from public bookshelves. I think that the larger issue here is not, do you particularly want to read Jack Abbott or Orson Scott Card or Shakespeare, who was in fact an anti-Semite, or do you want to make it impossible for other people to do so? I think everybody in this room would agree, read whatever the hell you want. But what about the question of, as Eric just suggested, suppression so that other people don't have access to these works either? And by suppression, I'm not only talking about the government, I am talking about the kind of social pressure that ostracizes a person who produces something that you don't particularly like. I think that those kinds of things are dangerous. And I think that's where the emphasis should be in terms of fighting, and not so much on, oh, well, this person is this or this person is that and I don't want their work. You're welcome to not want their work, but don't try to block access of other people to it. Now, I do think, I'm going to make one caveat on this, that where children are concerned, parents have the right to not want Hustler in the 3rd grade library. I mean, there are some issues involved here. But even that is a slippery slope. I once sat around on a porch with a bunch of female science fiction writers, and we were all talking about where we would draw the line to selling stories. The question specifically was, would you sell to Playboy? Would you sell to Penthouse? Would you sell to Omni, which was owned at that time by Bob Guccione and operated under the Penthouse empire? And would you sell to Hustler? Of the women who happened to be on that porch that day, we all drew the line at different places. There was one prominent SF writer who said, no, I wouldn't even sell to Playboy. I don't approve of it. And another one said, no, I'd sell to Playboy because they publish reputable fiction and good articles, but I wouldn't sell to Penthouse because they're too raunchy. Somebody else says, no, I would sell not to Penthouse or Playboy, but I would sell to Omni because they're not actually doing this, even if they're owned by Bob Guccione. There's one person who would sell to none of them, and none of us would have sold to Hustler, no matter how much we were offered. So yeah, writers and readers draw the line at their own individual places, but the larger question of drawing the line for other people, it is far more problematical and I think dangerous.
I posted this convention topic on this panel topic on my Facebook page, and solicited ideas about moral distance, and got an intelligent and completely different discussion than we're having here. And what that discussion was about was content of works that make you think badly of the author. And in particular, there was a particular horror writer who was named, who had, I gather from context, written a scene in which a dog is tortured, and that the people felt badly about, felt that this, that the author is a worse person for having written and published this scene.
The author is not his characters. Yeah. I don't know how often I get incensed about this. The characters are not the author. The author, a good author, is trying to observe the world around them and reproduce it in a way that is transformed into art, but also reproduces what's there. And there are people who torture dogs. If I write about someone who tortures dogs, and I have, that doesn't mean that I would do it.
If I'd known that, I wouldn't have bought your story. Where dogs torture people.
Wait a minute, you did buy my story where a dog is tortured.
I know.
If it had been a cat, I would have been another story.